The night was supposed to be like any other. A few beers, a couple of laughs, and the usual reckless adventures that Jason, Ricky, and Mark had grown accustomed to. But sometimes, even the strongest friendships collapse under the weight of betrayal, anger, and bad decisions. Jason Carter was no ordinary kid. At just 17, he had already built a reputation as someone you didn't mess with. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Chicago, he had learned that strength came from dominance, and fear was the most effective tool. Ricky and Mark were his closest friends. At least, that's what he thought. But loyalty was a fragile thing, and that night, everything shattered. The argument started small. Just some trash talk about a girl they all knew. Mark had made a joke, something about Jason's temper being the reason she dumped him. Ricky laughed a little too hard. Jason's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He wasn't the type to take insults lightly, not even from his best friends. Mark, sensing the shift in Jason's demeanor, tried to backpedal. "Relax, man. I was just messing around." But it was too late. Jason lunged at Mark, shoving him backward. Ricky stepped in between them, pushing Jason away. "Dude, chill out. It's not that serious." But to Jason, it was. Every fight, every insult, every moment of humiliation he had ever endured came flooding back. His mind clouded with rage. In that split second, something inside him snapped. He reached for the knife he always carried, a gift from his older brother, who was now serving time for armed robbery. The blade flashed under the dim streetlights as Jason drove it into Mark's stomach. A gasp escaped Mark's lips, his hands instinctively gripping the wound as blood began to spread across his hoodie. Ricky froze in horror, eyes wide with disbelief. "Jason, what the hell did you do?" Jason turned toward him, his breathing heavy. Ricky's survival instinct kicked in, and he bolted. But Jason wasn't thinking anymore. He was running on pure adrenaline. "Don't run from me," he shouted, chasing Ricky down the dark alley. His legs pumped with terrifying speed, and within seconds he tackled Ricky to the ground. They struggled, but Jason had the upper hand. He pinned Ricky down, and before he could even process what he was doing, the knife struck again. This time, straight into Ricky's chest. The struggle stopped. Silence filled the alley. Jason stood there, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reality of what he had done hit him like a freight train. Two bodies lay at his feet, two people who had once been his brothers. A siren wailed in the distance. Panic set in. Jason wiped his hands on his jeans, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here. He needed to disappear, fast. There was only one place where he thought he could escape the consequences of his actions: Canada. Jason's hands were still trembling as he ran through the empty streets, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind screamed at him to think, to come up with a plan, but all he could hear was the sound of Ricky's last breath and Mark's choked gasp of pain. They were dead, and he had killed them. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Someone must have heard the struggle. Maybe a security camera had caught him. It didn't matter. The cops would come looking for him soon. Jason ducked into a deserted alleyway, trying to calm himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Texts from friends. Ricky's cousin. "Dude, something happened to Ricky and Mark. You good? Mike. Bro, cops are all over the block. What's going on?" Unknown number. "We know what you did." Jason's stomach twisted. He had to leave. Not just the neighborhood, not just the city. He had to get out of the country. The plan to escape Canada. That was the only option. It was close enough to reach, and he had heard stories about criminals disappearing there. If he could cross the border, he could start fresh, maybe find work under a fake name. But first, he had to make it out of Chicago. He went to the only person he thought could help, his older cousin, Leon. Leon was no stranger to trouble. He had been in and out of juvie and had friends who knew how to make people disappear. Jason showed up at his door, his hoodie stained with blood. Leon's eyes narrowed. "What the hell did you do?" Jason hesitated, then muttered, "I need to get to Canada." Leon exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Damn, Jason, you really messed up." He glanced around before stepping aside. "Come in. We don't have much time." The police close in. Meanwhile, the Chicago Police Department was already working the case. Officers had arrived at the crime scene, two teenage boys brutally stabbed. Witnesses reported seeing Jason arguing with them earlier that night. His name was already on their list of suspects. Detective Ray Dawson, a veteran cop who had seen too many young lives wasted on violence, took the lead. He stared at the security footage from a nearby store. Jason, running from the scene. It was enough to put out an alert. "Find him," Dawson ordered his team, "before he vanishes." As Jason sat in Leon's apartment trying to control his shaking hands, Leon handed him a burner phone and a wad of cash. "You got one shot at this," Leon said. "A guy I know can get you across the border, but if the cops catch you first, you're done." Jason swallowed hard. He had no choice. He had to run, and he couldn't get caught. The mysterious stranger. Jason sat in the back of a rusted-out sedan, staring out at the dark highway as Leon's contact, a low-level smuggler named Vic, drove him north toward the U.S.-Canada border. The car smelled of cigarettes and cheap cologne, and Jason's heart pounded in his chest with every mile they covered. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" Vic asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Once you cross, there's no coming back." Jason clenched his fists. He had no choice. The Chicago PD was already looking for him, and it was only a matter of time before they showed up at Leon's place. He had to disappear. Vic sighed. "I got a guy near the border. He helps people like you get across for a price." Jason swallowed hard. "How much?" Vic smirked. "You don't got enough, but lucky for you, he likes deals." The border crossing hours later, they arrived at a secluded spot near the border, miles away from the official crossing. The place was nothing more than an abandoned barn, hidden deep in the woods. Vic parked the car and nodded toward a shadowy figure standing near the tree line. "That's your guy," Vic muttered. "Good luck." Jason stepped out of the car, pulling his hoodie tighter around his face. The man standing before him was tall, lean, and wrapped in a thick black coat. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his presence was unsettling. "You're looking to cross," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jason hesitated. "Yeah, I got money." The man chuckled. "Money ain't everything, kid. The border's hot right now. Cops are on the lookout, but I know a way." Jason glanced around nervously. "What's the catch?" The man took a step closer. "You do something for me, I do something for you." Jason didn't like the sound of that, but what choice did he have? "What do you want?" The man grinned. "There's a bag in the trunk of my truck. You take it across the border with you. No questions asked." Jason's gut twisted. Was he smuggling drugs? Weapons? "What's in it?" he asked. The man's smile faded. "Didn't I just say no questions asked?" Jason knew this was dangerous, but he also knew he was out of options. The police were closing in, and if he didn't get across the border soon, he was as good as dead, or in prison for life. He took a deep breath. "Fine," he said. "I'll do it." The man nodded, tossing Jason a heavy black duffel bag. "Then let's move." With his heart pounding, Jason followed the stranger into the darkness, toward the cold, uncertain future that awaited him in Canada. The betrayal. Jason trudged through the dense forest, his breath visible in the cold night air. The mysterious man, whom he now knew as Dante, led the way, his pace steady and confident. Jason gripped the black duffel bag tightly, its weight pressing down on his arm like an anchor. Every step he took felt heavier. His gut told him something was off. The way Dante kept glancing at him, the lack of urgency despite their supposed need to move quickly, it didn't sit right. "How much further?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not far," Dante replied without turning around. "Just past that ridge. There's a clearing where my guy will meet us." Jason nodded, but his paranoia was growing. He had trusted the wrong people before. Mark and Ricky were proof of that. And now he was trusting a stranger with his life. The setup, as they reached the ridge, Jason spotted a dirt road in the distance. Parked on the side was a black SUV with its headlights off. A man stood next to it, smoking a cigarette, his face obscured by the darkness. Dante suddenly stopped and turned to Jason. "Give me the bag," he said, stretching out his hand. Jason hesitated. You said I had to take it across. Dante smirked. Change of plans. Jason took a step back. His mind raced. Why would he change the plan now? Unless, in the distance, faint red and blue lights flickered through the trees. Jason's chest tightened. Police. His eyes snapped back to Dante, who was now standing with his hands in his pockets, too calm, too casual. You set me up, Jason muttered, his grip tightening on the bag. Dante chuckled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. He scanned his surroundings. He was in the middle of nowhere, with no allies, no backup. If the cops got him now, he was done. The escape attempt. Jason's survival instincts kicked in. He swung the duffel bag at Dante's head, knocking him off balance, and bolted toward the trees. Get him! Dante shouted. The man by the SUV flicked his cigarette away and reached for something. A gun. Jason ducked as a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past his shoulder. He sprinted into the darkness, weaving through the trees, his heart hammering against his ribs. Think, Jason. Think. He couldn't run forever. If they caught him, he was either dead or in prison. His only shot was to reach the border himself, but with the cops closing in and a traitor hunting him down, Jason was running out of time. And this time, there was no one left to trust. A shocking fate. Jason's legs burned as he sprinted through the dense forest, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps pounded behind him. Dante and his men were close, and the distant wail of police sirens was growing louder. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before they caught up. Branches whipped against his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The only thought running through his mind was escape, a desperate gamble. The border was near. Somewhere past these trees, past the river, was Canada, freedom. If he could reach it before the cops did, he had a chance. But the duffel bag, the bag Dante had given him, was slowing him down. Jason skidded to a stop and unzipped it. His stomach clenched at what he saw inside. Stacks of cash, a gun, and, worst of all, a brick of heroin. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a setup for his arrest. Dante had planned to kill him. Jason heard voices. Dante's men were closing in. He made a split-second decision. He grabbed the cash and the gun, then hurled the bag into the river. If he was caught, at least they wouldn't pin drug charges on him. He turned and ran again, his feet splashing through the mud. Final confrontation. Just as he reached the clearing near the border, headlights flashed through the trees. Jason shielded his eyes as an SUV skidded to a stop in front of him. The doors flew open. Dante. He stood there, smirking, gun in hand. You really thought you could outrun me, kid? Jason gripped his stolen gun, his hands shaking. You set me up. Dante shrugged. You were dead the moment you stepped in that car with Vic. The sound of sirens was deafening now. The cops were here. Jason's mind raced. He had two choices, surrender or fight. The police would charge him with murder, and Dante would make sure he never talked. But if he ran, Dante would shoot him down before he ever crossed the border. Jason's finger tightened on the trigger. I'm not going down for this. Dante laughed. Then don't. Bang. A gunshot rang out. Jason's body stiffened. He expected pain. But he wasn't the one who got shot. Dante stumbled backward, clutching his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. A second shot, then a third. Jason turned in shock. The police had arrived. Officers swarmed the area, guns drawn. Dante collapsed to the ground, his smirk finally gone. Jason raised his hands as an officer shouted, "Drop the weapon!" He had no fight left in him. The gun slipped from his fingers as he dropped to his knees. The police tackled him, forcing his hands behind his back. As he lay there, handcuffed, staring at the flashing lights, one thought echoed in his mind. He was alive. But was this freedom? Or just another kind of prison?